I love hearing him talk about when he was drafted to work on the Manhattan Project. And you think about it, it was an existential fear.
Yes.
Legitimate, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we wound up using it. They could have used it on us.
We did indeed.
Yes.
And when you hear Feynman talk about all the complication of that, we have an enormous scientific challenge. We have an enormous competition against the Germans who are trying to do the same thing. And then, even if we win, then we have another whole challenge, which is the moral challenge.
Yeah.
But there's a way of thinking about those things. And again, measuring the costs and benefits that people who might disagree aggressively, and they did about the Manhattan Project, can sit down and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. What's the lesser of the two evils? And I feel like right now, I don't know, it's as much progress as we've had, I feel we've gotten worse at looking at the lesser of two evil paths, at looking at weighing costs and benefits.
Well, what is the lesser of two evils in that regard? Is it drop the bombs and stop the war? Or is the lesser of two evils never drop the bomb and stop the war later?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a million books been written about this.
Yeah.
I could make an argument in either case. I mean, Japan, we were very, very scared of Japan. Japan had shown a lot of ability to punish the United States. Even though Germany was out, America still felt very fragile. So I totally get the argument that it was meant to be,
I get it too.
Yeah. On the other hand, you're picking some pretty big cities to drop it on, and you're picking two. So,
and you're killing mostly civilians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's hard to imagine that decision would be made today. But as you just said about, polio vaccine, different case, but roughly same time era, it's very hard to project your morals onto, 50 years from now, we may have a very different view about MMA, for instance. It's very hard to project it.
Well, I think that's far more intense and extreme than MMA. I mean, we're talking about nuking people literally out of existence. But I think that just the fact that these brilliant scientists were forced into that moral dilemma. Like, one of my favorite videos online is Oppenheimer, when he's discussing what he said when the first atomic bomb was detonated, and he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, and he said, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And it's just to say that, to see him. Have you seen it? The video? Oh, please let me play this for you. Play Oppenheimer right after, when describing what it was like, because it's so eerie. Because here you have one of the most brilliant scientists ever who completed this fantastic project.
Yeah.
The Manhattan Project created bombs that literally were nuclear weapons. It never happened before in all of human history, as far as we know. And here, the guy that did it, that knew that was going to be the death of untold amounts of people. Listen to this. Listen to what he says.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Dude, imagine being that guy. I mean, here's a guy, first of all, was quoting the Bhagavad Gita in 1945.
Yeah, a little ahead of his time.
Pretty incredible. Or 46? When did they first detonate?
40. The tests were, I think, 44, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki 45. Correct? I think.
Somewhere in that range. And being this guy who, he's just a brilliant scientist. He's not supposed to be the guy who destroys 500,000 people in one moment, one brief flash of light, and vaporizes 500,000 people.
He went to this school in New York City called the Ethical Culture Fieldston School, which is where my kids went. So Oppenheimer is kind of a patron saint for having the brains to do something almost unimaginable and having the ethics and courage to know that what he'd done was unacceptable on some levels.
Yeah.
You know, on the other hand, but look, if we're talking about costs and benefits, let's think about nuclear power, nuclear bombs as a deterrent against others down the road, right? So you have to say, killed a lot of people. How many lives did it save? Impossible to say.
You sound like a Republican, sir.
I know, but I mean,
That's
no.
the argument, right?
Then you also have to talk about, then let's also talk about nuclear power, which was the byproduct of this, right? Mm-hmm. And there are those who could argue, and I would probably aid this argument to say that if the U.S. had continued on the path of nuclear power in the 70s rather than totally flipping out after 3 Mile Island and then later Chernobyl, which was a much worse accident than 3 Mile Island, if that had continued, what we'd have now is probably much cleaner, cheaper, safer nuclear fuel.
Yes.
And instead, what happened, because we basically stopped building nuclear plants, instead, for the next 40 years, we burnt a crap load of coal. That's been terrible for the environment, for lives. A lot of lives lost in mining coal, but then the pollution and so on. So, you know, actions have consequences. What seems to be all benefit often has a lot of costs. And life is complicated, but I think the more that we can measure and weigh things sensibly, the less screaming there is. I just, you know, I love changing my mind. I love hearing somebody make an argument that makes me say, oh, you know, the way I thought about that before, I see why I thought it. I don't feel like a fool for having thought it, but wow, now that you've laid out some facts and laid out some counterfactuals, I appreciate the opportunity to change my mind. I enjoy that. I don't know why.
I do too. Well, I think we're so often married to our ideas, like our ideas are a part of us, and we're losing if our ideas that we've been discussing are incorrect. If our assumptions were incorrect, it's a value judgment against us.
Right.
You know, I think the nuclear thing is interesting because I think one of the problems with what happened was the shitty design of like Fukushima, where they can't shut it off. It's freaked people out, rightly so.
And it's built in a bad spot.
It's
plainly.
a terrible spot.
Yeah,
and the backup plants sucked. Everything's wrong. And now they have this nuclear hotspot that they're, you know, it's going to be like that for 100,000 years.
Right.
There's a better way, and they never had a chance to find that better way because they've had a better way for everything else. And the later ones, the ones that they're operational now, are far better than the Fukushima one. And they could have gotten way better. And it's one of those things that doesn't seem like it makes sense. Like, wait a minute, nuclear's clean? But it's fucking really clean. It's really clean if it's done right. And if they allowed them to innovate over those 40 years, we would have got to some place where it's like super efficient, just like everything else. If you look at a 1970 car, right? And then you look at a car from 2020, how about a Tesla? Zero emissions.
Right.
Like maybe they would figure out how to really knock it down to